As I said, the ladies are away at the retreat this weekend, and this year, Debbie and her mom and the girls went on the ladies' retreat, which is really cool. I mean, I miss them and all, but it's really cool that they can be there, and it's really cool that I can have a weekend by myself. I don't know how you guys feel, but man, I get the whole house to myself, and I get the TV to myself, which is really nice. I get to watch what I want to watch, and actually, one of the things I came across Friday night, I was looking through Amazon Prime, and one of the movies that was free on Amazon Prime is one of my favorites, a movie called Miracle. Have you ever seen it? It tells first of all, I'm a sucker for a well-made inspirational movie that's based on a true story. If it's based on a true story, it always piques my interest. So I love that movie. And this tells the story of the USA hockey team, men's hockey team, and their win over the Soviet Union in the 1980 Olympics. I'm kind of showing my age. I remember when that happened. I was watching, which was pretty cool. But anyway, it was arguably the greatest underdog story in sports history. You see, back then, the Olympics, they were basically played by amateurs from every nation, right? They weren't pro athletes. They were amateur athletes, right? So the USA, when they would have these team sports, they would send college players, right? And they wouldn't send the pros like they do now and all these guys with all kinds of experience, but they would send college players to represent their country. Unfortunately, some countries bent that rule a little bit, and one of the countries that did that was the Soviet Union. Their team was the most dominant team, the most dominant hockey team in the world at that time. And their team was technically made up of amateurs. You see, their team, they basically all played for a team called the Red Army team. They were all part of the Soviet military. But they didn't have any military responsibilities, these guys on the Soviet Red Army team. Basically, they were just put there so they would all live together, so they could dedicate themselves to hockey and playing together day after day, year after year. And they were paid to do it. But quote-unquote amateurs, because they were just soldiers. So it was a kind of a way of getting it around. And they were so dominant. Here's some of what they did. The Soviets, they entered Olympic competition with hockey in 1956 Olympics. And up until 1980, they had won the gold medal every time but once. In fact, since 1968, they hadn't lost a game in all competitions. That's how good they were. In 1979, the year before the Olympics, they came to the United States to play a series of exhibition games against NHL All-Stars, the best our league had to offer. And the Soviets crushed them every game. And then on February 10th, just days before the Olympics in 1980, the Soviets play this Team USA in an exhibition match at Madison Square Garden, and they destroy them 10-3. And it just looked bad. I mean, although Team USA, they had some decent players, some talent, they had only been formed 6 months earlier. And the Soviets have played years together. The Soviets were bigger, they were more skilled, they were faster, they were more experienced than Team USA. So, it's 12 days later, and Team USA is sitting in the locker room getting ready to take the ice in the medal round of the Olympics against this same team that dominates the world and had just destroyed them. There was no way they had a chance, did they? And as I tried to put myself in their shoes, and I tried to say, man, I wonder what that feels like. I got reminded of another guy who was a similar underdog in his time. And it was overwhelming. So let me take you back to a different story. The year's 520 BC, and this man's name was Zerubbabel. We've been talking about Zerubbabel, right? the spotlight shines on him now as we continue our journey through this book of Haggai this morning, as we're looking at Haggai. So the spotlight kind of shines on him. So why don't you turn to Haggai this morning? You remember where Haggai is? Towards the end of the Old Testament, between the Z's, Zephaniah and Zechariah, 3 books from the end. You can turn to Haggai, and I'm going to set the stage of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel, okay, he had a past, but it wasn't anything to be proud of. You see, Zerubbabel, his grandfather was a guy named Jehoiachin. And Jehoiachin was the last king over God's people, the people of Judah, right? In Judah. And he wasn't a good guy. In fact, Jehoiachin, he only reigned over Judah for 3 years. And it said that he did evil in the sight of God. So much so that God's judgment fell upon him and the kingdom. They were defeated in battle and taken to be captives by the Babylonians. Okay? So God's chosen people, his nation, ceases to be a kingdom anymore, right? Because of Jehoiachin. Actually, although Jehoiachin was bad, his dad was even worse. His dad was a guy named King Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim, although he had a great father, his father was Josiah, who was a king that followed God. Jehoiakim didn't follow God. In fact, he was so evil that he oppressed his own people. He killed every prophet that God had sent to him, and then he passed that down to his son Jehoiachin. So anyway, this was Zerubbabel's legacy. This was his past. Basically, the end of God's patience with his people and the end of the kings of Judah. It's a legacy of failure, right? Now add to this Zerubbabel's new job. Zerubbabel has a new job now. He grew up in captivity under the Babylonians and now the Persians. And he wasn't made a king like his grandfather. Instead, he was made a governor of this tiny new province that's part of the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire actually had 120 provinces. And one of the smallest and least populated province, tucked away, kind of hidden away in the Persian Empire, was this new province of Judah. So, and it was tucked away, and it had hostile neighbors, it wasn't great, and all these things, right? Anyway, Zerubbabel was made the governor of this and sent back with this small remnant of Jews, about 50,000 Jews, and they were tasked with rebuilding God's temple, right? And the first 2 years back, things progressed pretty well, but then work came to a halt on the temple. The people got distracted, they were oppressed, and they had a failure in leadership. Who was the leader? Zerubbabel. So again, more failure, right? Now it was the 6th month of the year, 16 years after work had ceased, 18 years after they come back, and it's the 6th month of the year that God sends a messenger, right? Prophet Haggai. And he delivers 4 messages to Zerubbabel and God's people to help get them back to work, but also to help build their faithfulness to God. In fact, his first message he shared with them was in the 6th month, and it was about priorities, making God a priority. And because of that, the people repented, led by Zerubbabel and the high priest, whose name was Joshua, and the people began working again. A month later, though, the people start to get discouraged. Remember, we were looking at this. The people get discouraged. They're looking at the building they're building, this temple they're building. They're saying it's nothing compared to Solomon's. We can't do anything right. And it's such a big job anyway. How are we ever going to finish it? But Haggai comes with another message of encouragement, giving them clarity, saying, well, look, it's not just you, it's God working in and through you. And they continue work. It's now the 9th month, actually the 24th day of the 9th month, when Haggai brings a 3rd message. And we looked at this last week, right? It was about not only the importance of rebuilding the temple, but also the importance of heart devotion to God or holiness. So here sits Zerubbabel, right, with a legacy of failure and shame, trying to lead God's people in this monumental task with a half-built temple that doesn't even look like much in this tiny forgotten province in the Persian Empire. It's pretty overwhelming, isn't it? Can you relate to this? Have you ever felt like Zerubbabel, where you're looking at everything around you and it's overwhelming and you don't feel like much? You're overwhelmed, you feel like you've been forgotten, you're seeing nothing go your way, and you just kind of want to crawl in a hole somewhere and hide. Well, this is Zerubbabel. Well, Haggai has one more message to share in this little book, to help build faithfulness in God. It's not only for Zerubbabel, but it's also for us, so that we can confidently follow God's call right here and now. So we're going to pick up in Haggai. So hopefully you're there by now. And we're going to pick up in verse 20. It's kind of where we left off with Haggai. It says, "The word of the Lord came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month. It says, 'Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah.'" So, basically, to set the stage, it's later the same day that he just gave this message on holiness or heart devotion to God. He gives it to the people. Now Haggai says, "Zerubbabel, I need to talk with you. I have one more message, and it's for you." So, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, "I am about to shake the heavens and the earth, and to overthrow the thrones of kingdoms. I am about to destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations, and overthrow the chariots and their riders. And the horses and the riders shall go down, every one by the sword of his brother. On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and make you like a signet ring. For I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts." Now, this is pretty cool. Every one of these messages has been pretty cool. But basically here, God through Haggai is giving Zerubbabel a pep talk to help him not only remain faithful in his task, but also to change his whole outlook on life, change his outlook on his past and his present and even his future. You see, this fourth message of Haggai is all about purpose. In fact, this is the fourth building block in building faithfulness. And more specifically, it's about God's purpose. In fact, some of what God is saying to Zerubbabel is specific just to Zerubbabel. But in this, there are truths that apply to us as well. And when we trust them, these truths about God and these truths about God's purpose, our faithfulness to God will grow. So let's take kind of a closer look at this, right? At our passage this morning, where we're going to find that we can follow God in our world more confidently when we trust, like Zerubbabel, that first of all, God has a purpose. Things aren't just random. God has a plan. In fact, look back at the passage, and I want you to see, every time you look at Scripture, when you're trying to see what a passage is talking about, some of the things you look at are words that are repeated. Because if God repeats a bunch of words over and over again, he's trying to get something across. And one of the words you see repeated in this passage a lot is the word I, right? There are these I statements that God makes. I am about to shake the heavens and the earth, right? I'm about to destroy the strengths of the kingdom. And on that day, I will take you, for I have chosen you, says the Lord of hosts, right? You know what this is about? It's God saying, I have a plan. There's things that are definite. I have a purpose. God doesn't say, you know, it'd be nice if this kind of happens. You know, if it turns out. He doesn't say, you know, if things break my way. Now, God says he has made plans and they're set. They're firm. This is my purpose. I know what it is. I'm clear with this purpose, and I want to share it with you. It's not shaken by anything that you see, Zerubbabel, and it's not shaken by anything that we see around us that may take us down or give us doubt. In fact, the prophet Isaiah kind of talks about God's purpose in this way. In Isaiah 14, he says, "The Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand." Now, for Zerubbabel, again, these statements of purpose were about what God was going to do. All of what he's saying about shaking the earth and all of these things and destroying the kingdoms and raising up and defeating all the darkness around, right? It's not necessarily what God's going to do in Zerubbabel's lifetime. Actually, it's long after Zerubbabel's gone, and it's through Jesus. So these statements of purpose are God's purpose through Jesus. This shaking and defeating, it would happen when Jesus comes to the earth. When he comes to defeat sin and death on the cross, right? And through his resurrection. And then this purpose is completed when he returns a second time to rule and reign. This is what God is talking about to Zerubbabel. And this is the same plan or same purpose that God has shared throughout history before Zerubbabel. It's the same purpose and plan he gave to Abraham and his promise to Abraham that I will bless you, I'll make you a blessing that all nations of the earth will be blessed. Through who? Jesus. It's the same purpose that he had given to Moses. So now he's just repeating his purpose now to Zerubbabel and saying, I wanted you to be clear. This is what it's about. It's about Jesus, and it's about restoring people to me. Even though the people had fallen, even though Zerubbabel's family legacy, it was marked with shame and failure, this purpose of God was never shaken. And that's what God's saying. It's still here. It hasn't gone anywhere. You know, God has a plan for us. God has his purpose for us, and his plans are never shaken. Do you ever feel the exact opposite of that? Do you ever feel like you've messed up too bad? Or that your world is shaken and God can't possibly work? Maybe it's family tension going on. Maybe it's something, a health emergency, financial things. You know, all these things that can happen to us where everything's kind of going along smoothly and it feels calm and easy. And then bam! In the blink of an eye, it's chaos. And it hits us out of left field, and we say, what just happened? And although we can feel like everything's shaken, God is not. He and his plans never waver. They never change. And because of that, we can count on him. Even in times where we don't feel very confident. We can put our confidence in him. And this will be an encouragement for Zerubbabel, and hopefully it's an encouragement for us. But there's something else that Haggai's saying in the same statement that helps us follow God in our world more confidently, and that's when we trust that not only does God have a purpose, but he also will accomplish that purpose. See, it's one thing to kind of have that purpose, it's one thing to have a plan, and it's another thing to see that plan through, to make sure it happens. Remember the boxer Mike Tyson? He used to say when he was in his prime and he was unstoppable, he says, you know, everybody's got a plan until they get hit in the teeth. You know, we all have a plan as long as things are going well, but once something doesn't go well, man, our plans can change. But God's never do. You know why? Because no matter what happens, God makes sure his plan always comes about. He will accomplish his purpose. So we look back at these I statements of God, right? These statements where he talks about his purpose. They aren't wishes. They aren't questions. They aren't conditional. Do you notice that? God doesn't say, you know, I'm going to do these things, Zerubbabel, if you finish the temple. So get back to work. He doesn't say that, does he? He doesn't say, I'm going to do these things when you prove that you've changed. And when my people have proved they've changed, that they're really sorry and they really are committed to me and devoted to me. He doesn't say to Zerubbabel, I'm going to do these things because you've done something right, or because you've earned it, or because you deserve this. These statements aren't even conditioned on whether or not God can do them. No, what this passage states is that not only can God do these things, He will do these things. These will happen. You know, Zerubbabel, if you're not faithful to me, I'm still doing this. I want to tell you, if the temple never gets built, this is what's going to happen because this is my purpose. Isaiah also talks about this a little bit in Isaiah 46. He says, remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God and there is no other. I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things that are yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand and I will accomplish all my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it. Nothing and no one can keep God from accomplishing what He sets out to do. There's no failure too big, no task too great, no opposition too powerful. No matter what things may look like, God always wins. He never fails. And you know, this not only applied for Zerubbabel, it applies for us today. Do you ever feel like Zerubbabel? You ever feel like Team USA sitting in the locker room getting ready to face huge, insurmountable odds? If we take the time to look around us, I don't know about you, but we can really get down, can't we? I mean, evil seems to be winning at every turn. Every place we're turning, we're saying, well, this isn't going well. This isn't going well. Wow. Things look bleak, right? In our own lives. Maybe for us, we look at our own lives and we see a sin or we see a failure that we can't seem to shake. And even though we've kind of seen it defeated for a really long time, it all of a sudden pops back up to remind us, I'm still here. And you're just like, how long? When can we get this? Maybe it's looking at the news, and don't look at the news. It's depressing, isn't it? I mean, you see violence, divisiveness, unrest, sin gaining ground everywhere we look, right? And it can all be demoralizing. Like we're losing and God is getting pushed out. So here, God reminds Zerubbabel, God reminds us that no, I never fail. There's nothing too big for me to overcome, not only in you, but also through you. God will accomplish His purpose. In fact, you know, this message, it was particularly important for Zerubbabel, because this purpose was all about Jesus. Jesus, the Messiah, the coming Messiah, right? He was to come through the kingly line of Judah, wasn't he? Through David. But the line of kings had stopped, hadn't it? It had stopped with his grandfather, with Jehoiachin. It was cut off. Zerubbabel, he was no king, was he? No, he was merely some governor. Glorified babysitter, right? Under a foreign empire. There was no more empire of God's people to reign over. Yet Zerubbabel could have hope. God had a purpose. And you know what? He wasn't even finished with Zerubbabel yet. In fact, as we kind of look at this last verse, right? And as Haggai closes this message, we see that, like Zerubbabel, we can follow God more confidently in our world when we trust that God's purpose, that not only does God have a purpose and he's going to accomplish it, but God's purpose, it includes us. This purpose, what God had shared with Zerubbabel, was not only an encouragement for him. It wasn't just encouraging him that, yeah, I got a purpose and it's not going to fail. In verse 23, this last verse, we find that it included Zerubbabel. He was part of this. You see, Zerubbabel, again, he carried family failure with him, didn't he? And because of this, he felt lacking. He felt kind of responsible, shamed, because the kingly line stopped with his grandfather. His grandfather and him, they had failed. In fact, this kingly line, here's really what God did to Jehoiachin. Okay, and how bad it was. Jeremiah talks about what God did with Jehoiachin. And it says this, "As I live, declares the Lord, through Conai," which is another name for Jehoiachin, okay? "The son of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, were the signet ring on my right hand. You were the signet ring on my right hand, yet I would tear you off. I would remove it from you." Now, the signet ring, this is very important. Do you know what a signet ring is from a king? It had a kingly seal on it, right? And this ring was very important because whoever had this ring had the power and the authority of the king. When the king would send a message, they would take wax and they'd seal the message, and then he'd put the ring on it, would make the stamp, and that's how they would know that what came was the king's word. It was true. It had that power, that authority to it. Okay, that's the signet ring, official sign of authority. And he said, basically, God said, "I removed that from Jehoiachin," or "I removed it from the kings." That's now broken, that line. But here, something different happens, doesn't it? God had taken this from Jehoiachin, and then, again, in essence, was taking away his authority as a king, right? But this is what makes what God shares with Zerubbabel so awesome in verse 23. Look back at verse 23 for a second. He says, "On that day, declares the Lord of hosts, I will take you, O Zerubbabel, my servant, the son of Shealtiel, declares the Lord, and I will make you a signet ring. For I have chosen you, declares the Lord of hosts." So God calls Zerubbabel, he says, calls him his servant, right? First of all. And then he says that Zerubbabel will now be made God's signet ring, his official sign of authority. God says, "I have chosen you." God had chosen Zerubbabel, not because of any accomplishments he had, not because of any success or anything like this, but according to God's purpose, he chose them to represent or redeem the royal line, to continue God's plan of redemption for the world through Jesus. This is what God's saying to Zerubbabel. I'm not only going to restore you, but I want to use you. I want to include you in my purpose of the redemptive plan of what all of history is moving towards. And you're a key to that. In fact, it was through Zerubbabel, who again is through this line of Judah, so the prophecies, all of Jesus and the promises of Jesus still comes through Jesus, right? It was through his line that Jesus came. In fact, Zerubbabel is one of the people mentioned in the genealogies of Jesus, not only in Matthew, but also Luke. What an honor. What a restoration. See, even though he'd never be an earthly king, he'd never be famous, he'd never have this majestic temple that people would look at and say, this Zerubbabel, man, what a guy. What accomplishments he had. Even though he would have that, through no work of his own, through no pedigree, no accomplishment, no perfection. It was through Zerubbabel that God's faithfulness in his promised Messiah was shown. Talk about an amazing purpose. People are pointed to Jesus through him. You know, we're also included in God's purpose. Do you know that? God's purpose includes us. Through no work of our own, through no pedigree, no accomplishments, no perfection that we had, we are made God's signet ring of sorts. We're made representatives of God's authority in sharing Jesus. Now, the picture isn't necessarily a signet ring, but it's something else. And Paul uses an analogy for this in 2 Corinthians. He says, therefore, as those who experienced Jesus, right? Those who are in Christ are a new creation. Us, therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ. God making his appeal through us. We implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. You see, we are not unimportant. We are not insignificant. We are not ordinary. Rather, we are ambassadors, official representatives sent out into our world in his purpose of salvation, redemption. God's purpose includes us and means we have much to bring to our world. A world that's lost without Jesus. That's encouraging, isn't it? So just as God came to encourage Zerubbabel, a guy who's feeling insignificant and facing all of this uncertainty, he also encourages us through his purpose that is always accomplished, making it very certain that this purpose includes us. And this makes us very significant. You see, this book, this prophecy, this message, these messages of Haggai, you know, his message is about so much more than just rebuilding a temple, than just putting blocks on top of blocks and getting back to work. It's about building faithfulness. Faithfulness in following God's call, in sharing Jesus with our world. So this week, be encouraged in your life this week. When things start to not go your way and things start getting chaotic and you flip on the news for some unknown reason and you're seeing all the scare things that are going on and all of these things and the sky is falling and we have no hope and we have no chance and God no longer matters, guess what? Be encouraged. God has a plan. He always accomplishes it. And that plan includes us. And it's a plan to present Jesus as the only source of hope, the only source of life, the only source of salvation with our world. There's nothing that we will face this week, this year, that God isn't bigger than. And nothing that we do that's unimportant when he is accomplishing his purpose of presenting Jesus in and through us. So, this is Haggai, this little 2-chapter book tucked away towards the end of the Old Testament. But it may be little, but it packs a huge message that can transform our lives today as we follow Jesus.